The rain fell softly on the cobblestones of London as Catherine, the Princess of Wales, stood by her bedroom window at Kensington Palace. Her fingers traced the glass as she watched the droplets race down the surface, much like the tears that had been falling across Britain for the past 3 days. The news had shaken everyone to their core, and even within the protected walls of the palace, the weight of the nation's grief felt unbearable. It was a Tuesday morning when the first reports came in. A tragic accident at a primary school in Manchester had claimed the lives of 12 young children and 3 teachers. The details were still emerging, but what was certain was that an entire community had been devastated, and the ripple effects were being felt across the country. Parents everywhere held their children a little tighter. Teachers questioned their safety protocols, and the nation collectively mourned for families they had never met, but whose pain they could deeply understand. William entered the room quietly, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something more vulnerable. He had spent the morning in meetings with palace staff, government officials, and security teams, all discussing the appropriate royal response to the tragedy. The weight of his position had never felt heavier than it did in moments like these, when protocol and genuine human emotion had to find a way to coexist. Catherine turned from the window to face her husband. No words were needed between them. They had been married long enough to communicate entire conversations through glances, and right now, both of their hearts were breaking for the same reason. She moved toward him, and he wrapped his arms around her, both of them finding comfort in the simple act of human connection during such a dark time. The palace had already released an official statement expressing their condolences to the affected families and the Manchester community. Flowers were being arranged to be sent, and plans were being made for a more formal response in the coming days. But Catherine knew, deep in her heart, that standard procedures would not be enough this time. This tragedy required something more personal, more human, more real. As they held each other in the quiet of their private quarters, both William and Catherine found themselves thinking about their own children. George, Charlotte, and Louis were safely at school, probably completely unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded hundreds of miles away. The thought of other parents who would never again have the simple pleasure of picking up their children from school, of never again hearing their laughter echo through their homes, was almost too much to bear. Catherine pulled back slightly and looked into William's eyes. She could see the same thoughts reflecting back at her, the same questions that had no answers, the same desperate desire to do something meaningful in the face of such overwhelming loss. It was in that moment that she knew what they had to do, even though it went against every piece of advice they would likely receive from their advisors. The idea came to her suddenly, but with such clarity that she knew it was right. She thought about her own experiences as a mother, about the times when her children had been hurt or scared, and how the only thing that mattered in those moments was being present, being there, offering whatever comfort could be given. The families in Manchester needed more than flowers and formal statements. They needed to know that their grief was seen, that their children's lives mattered, that in their darkest hour, they were not alone. William listened as Catherine quietly shared her thoughts. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the emotion underlying every word. She spoke about the power of presence, about how sometimes the most meaningful gesture was simply showing up, not as royalty performing a duty, but as parents who understood that some losses were too profound for words. They talked for over an hour, walking through the implications of what Catherine was proposing. They knew it would be unprecedented in many ways. Royal visits to tragedy sites were typically carefully orchestrated affairs, planned weeks in advance, with extensive security measures and media coordination. What Catherine was suggesting was something much more spontaneous, much more personal, and much more risky from a protocol standpoint. But as they continued to discuss it, both of them became more convinced that this was exactly what the moment required. They thought about the Queen, about how she had always emphasized that their role was ultimately about service to the people. They thought about Diana, and how she had revolutionized royal engagement by bringing genuine human emotion into public service. They thought about their own values as parents and as people, and they knew that sometimes doing the right thing meant stepping outside the boundaries of what was expected. By the afternoon, they had made their decision. Catherine would travel to Manchester, not for an official royal visit, but as one mother reaching out to other mothers in their time of unimaginable grief. There would be no fanfare, no media circus, no formal ceremonies, just a quiet presence, an offer of support, and a willingness to sit with families in their pain without trying to fix what could never be fixed. The palace staff were initially resistant to the idea. Security concerns were raised, protocol questions were asked, and media management issues were discussed at length. But William and Catherine remained firm in their conviction. Sometimes, they argued, the most important things they could do, as members of the royal family, had nothing to do with tradition or protocol, and everything to do with basic human decency and compassion. As Catherine prepared for the journey, she thought carefully about every detail. What would she wear? How would she approach grieving families? What could she possibly say to parents who had lost everything? The weight of responsibility felt enormous, but it was balanced by an equally strong sense of purpose. This was why they were in the positions they held, not to be distant figures in a palace, but to serve their people in meaningful ways, especially during their darkest hours. The evening before her departure, Catherine sat with her own children as they prepared for bed. She hugged them a little longer than usual, grateful beyond words for their presence, their health, their beautiful, ordinary problems and joys. Tomorrow, she would meet parents who would give anything for one more evening like this with their children. And that knowledge made every moment with George, Charlotte, and Louis feel precious beyond measure. The journey to Manchester felt longer than usual, despite the fact that Catherine had made this trip countless times before for various royal engagements. But this time was different. There were no briefing papers to review, no schedule of events to memorize, no list of important people to meet. Instead, she sat quietly in the car, her hands folded in her lap, preparing herself emotionally for what lay ahead. She had chosen to wear a simple black dress, her grandmother's pearl earrings, and minimal makeup. Everything about her appearance was designed to communicate respect, humility, and genuine care rather than royal grandeur. Her security team had been briefed on the unusual nature of this visit. There would be no red carpets, no ceremonial greetings, no photo opportunities. This was about being present with grieving families, nothing more and nothing less. As they approached Manchester, Catherine could see the evidence of the community's grief everywhere. Flowers lined the streets leading to the school, makeshift memorials had sprung up on every corner, and people moved through the area with the slow, careful steps of those carrying heavy hearts. The sight of it all made her own heart ache, but it also strengthened her resolve. She was exactly where she needed to be. The first stop was the home of Sarah and Michael Henderson, parents of 8-year-old Emma who had been lost in the tragedy. Catherine had specifically requested that there be no media present, no photographers, no official record of these visits beyond what the families themselves chose to share. She wanted these moments to be sacred, private spaces where grief could be honored without the pressure of public scrutiny. When Sarah Henderson opened her front door and saw Catherine standing there, the surprise on her face quickly gave way to something deeper. Here was another mother. Someone who understood the fierce love that parents feel for their children. Someone who had chosen to show up not because protocol demanded it, but because her heart had led her there. They sat together in the Hendersons' living room, surrounded by photographs of Emma. Catherine listened as Sarah shared memories of her daughter, her love of drawing, her dreams of becoming a teacher, her infectious laugh that had filled their home for 8 beautiful years. Catherine didn't try to offer solutions or explanations. She simply listened, held Sarah's hands when the tears came, and shared in the sacred act of remembering a precious life that had been cut far too short. Michael Henderson later said that what struck him most about Catherine's visit was how present she was. She wasn't checking her phone, wasn't looking at her watch, wasn't rushing through the conversation to get to the next obligation. She was completely there with them. In their grief, in their memories, in their love for their daughter. It was a gift, more precious than any formal condolence letter or official palace statement could ever be. From the Henderson home, Catherine moved quietly through the community, visiting family after family. At the Jackson household, She sat with parents who were struggling to explain to their surviving children why their sister wouldn't be coming home. At the Kumar residence, she held the hand of a grandmother who had lost her grandson and was questioning everything she had ever believed about fairness and justice in the world. Each visit was unique, but there were common threads that ran through all of them. Parents who felt lost in their grief found comfort in talking to someone who clearly understood the depth of parental love. Families who had felt forgotten in their pain found solace in being seen and heard by someone who had chosen to seek them out. Children who had lost siblings found reassurance in Catherine's gentle presence and her ability to speak to them at their level about their feelings and fears. Word of Catherine's presence began to spread through the community, but not in the way that royal visits typically generated attention. Instead, it moved quietly from house to house, family to family, like a gentle ripple of comfort spreading through the area. People didn't gather to catch a glimpse of royalty. Instead, they simply felt a little less alone in their grief, knowing that someone cared enough to be there with them. At the school itself, Catherine spent time with the surviving teachers and staff members who were grappling with their own trauma and guilt. She listened to their stories, acknowledged their pain, and helped them understand that their feelings were valid and important. Many of them had been so focused on supporting the students and families that they hadn't taken time to process their own emotional wounds. Mrs. Patricia Williams, who had taught at the school for 23 years and had lost 3 of her colleagues in the tragedy, later described her conversation with Catherine as a turning point in her healing process. Catherine had asked her about each of the teachers who had been lost, wanting to know about their personalities, their passions, their contributions to the school community. The act of sharing these memories helped Mrs. Williams begin to process her grief in a healthy way. As the day continued, something remarkable began to happen. The families and community members who had been visited by Catherine started reaching out to each other, creating connections that hadn't existed before the tragedy. Grief, which can often be isolating, was becoming a bridge that brought people together. Catherine's simple act of showing up had catalyzed something beautiful within the community. The local clergy, who had been struggling to find words to comfort their congregations in the wake of the tragedy, found themselves inspired by Catherine's approach. Rather than trying to explain the unexplainable or fix the unfixable, they began to focus more on simply being present with their parishioners, listening to their pain, and holding space for their grief. As evening approached, Catherine made one final stop at the temporary memorial that had been created near the school. She placed a simple bouquet of white roses among the thousands of flowers that had been left by community members and visitors from across the country. She knelt quietly among the tributes, reading some of the messages that had been left, adding her own silent prayers to the countless others that had been offered in this sacred space. A small group of community members had gathered at a respectful distance, not wanting to intrude but feeling drawn to witness this moment. They watched as Catherine remained kneeling for several minutes, her head bowed, completely absorbed in her private thoughts and prayers. When she finally stood and turned to leave, many of them had tears in their eyes, not because they had seen royalty, but because they had witnessed genuine compassion in action. The ride back to London was quiet, but Catherine felt a sense of peace that she hadn't expected. She knew that her visits couldn't take away anyone's pain or bring back the precious lives that had been lost. But she also knew that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for someone who is suffering is simply to show up, to be present, to acknowledge their pain and honor their love. As her car pulled away from Manchester, Catherine looked back one final time at the community that had welcomed her so graciously into their grief. Tomorrow, the formal royal responses would begin. There would be official memorial services, charitable donations, and policy discussions about school safety. But tonight, she carried with her the sacred privilege of having shared in the most human of experiences, the deep love that connects us all, especially in our darkest hours. The impact of Catherine's quiet visits to Manchester began to unfold in ways that no one could have predicted. In an age where every royal move was typically documented, analyzed, and broadcast around the world, the absence of official photos or media coverage of her time with the grieving families created something entirely different. The story spread, not through news outlets or social media posts, but through the most powerful medium of all: human connection and word of mouth. Sarah Henderson was the first to share her experience. 3 days after Catherine's visit, she posted a simple message on her personal social media account. She didn't include any photos or details about protocol. Instead, she wrote about a mother who had sat with her in her darkest hour, who had listened to stories about Emma without trying to rush or fix anything, and who had reminded her that her daughter's life had mattered deeply to people she had never met. The post was shared by a few family friends, then by their friends, and soon it was spreading across the internet like wildfire. But unlike the typical viral royal content that focused on fashion choices or official duties, this story touched something much deeper in people's hearts. Comments poured in from parents around the world who were moved by the simple act of one mother reaching out to another in grief. Michael Kumar, who had initially been skeptical about any royal involvement in their tragedy, found himself compelled to speak about his experience as well. He called into a local radio station to share how Catherine had sat with his family, how she had asked thoughtful questions about his son's interests and dreams, and how her presence had somehow made their unbearable loss feel just slightly more bearable. The radio interview was picked up by other stations, then by podcasts, and eventually by international news outlets. But what made this story different from typical royal coverage was its focus on the human elements rather than the institutional ones. People weren't talking about what Catherine wore or how the visit was organized. They were talking about kindness, presence, and the power of showing up for others in their darkest moments. Mrs. Patricia Williams, the longtime teacher who had lost 3 colleagues, decided to write a letter to her local newspaper. In it, she described how Catherine's visit had helped her begin to heal, not through any grand gestures or promises, but through the simple act of being truly seen and heard. She wrote about how Catherine had asked her to share memories of each teacher who had been lost, and how talking about their lives, rather than just their deaths, had been profoundly healing. The letter struck a chord with readers, many of whom began to reflect on their own experiences with grief and loss. Teachers from around the country reached out to share their own stories, creating an unexpected network of support that extended far beyond Manchester. The tragedy that had initially seemed to divide and devastate was somehow becoming a catalyst for connection and community. As news of Catherine's private visits continued to spread, something remarkable began happening across Britain and beyond. People started reaching out to neighbors, friends, and even strangers who were going through difficult times. Inspired by Catherine's example of quiet presence rather than grand gestures, individuals began making their own small acts of kindness and connection. A mother in Scotland drove 3 hours to sit with a friend whose child had been diagnosed with a serious illness. A teacher in Wales organized a support group for colleagues who were struggling with their own trauma and stress. Elderly residents in nursing homes found themselves receiving unexpected visits from young families who simply wanted to share their time and presence. The Manchester community itself was transformed by the ripple effects of Catherine's visit. Families who had been isolated in their grief began connecting with each other, sharing resources, memories, and support. The school district established new programs for mental health and community building, inspired by the healing they had witnessed in their own community. Local businesses began participating in what became known as presence over presence, a movement focused on giving time and attention rather than material goods to those who were struggling. Coffee shops offered quiet spaces for people to gather and talk. Bookstores hosted reading circles for grieving families, and community centers opened their doors for informal support groups. The national conversation about how society responds to tragedy began to shift as well. Rather than focusing solely on policy changes or financial support, there was growing recognition of the importance of emotional and spiritual care for communities in crisis. Mental health professionals noted an increase in people seeking help, but also an increase in people offering to volunteer their time to support others. William watched the unfolding impact of Catherine's decision with a mixture of pride and amazement. He had supported her choice from the beginning, but even he hadn't anticipated how profoundly it would resonate with people. During their private conversations, Catherine shared stories from the families she had visited, and both of them were moved by how the simple act of presence had created such far-reaching effects. The royal family's approach to public service began to evolve as well. Other members of the family started incorporating more unannounced, informal visits into their schedules. Rather than always appearing at highly orchestrated events, they began showing up at community centers, local hospitals, and neighborhood gatherings where they could have more genuine interactions with the people they served. 6 months after the tragedy, the Manchester community held a memorial service that was unlike anything that had been done before. Instead of a formal ceremony focused on speeches and official tributes, it was designed as a celebration of life and connection. Families shared stories, teachers and students performed music and art pieces, and the entire community participated in activities that honored both the lives that had been lost and the bonds that had been strengthened. Catherine and William attended the memorial service, but not as the guests of honor or featured speakers. They sat quietly among the community members, participating in the shared experience of remembrance and hope. Their presence was noted and appreciated, but it didn't overshadow the real focus of the day: the resilience and love of a community that had found ways to heal together. The children who had survived the tragedy were the ones who perhaps understood most clearly what had happened in their community. They had seen adults come together in ways that transcended differences of background, belief, or circumstance. They had witnessed how simple acts of kindness could create powerful changes. Most importantly, they had learned that even in the face of unimaginable loss, people could choose connection over isolation, presence over absence, and love over fear. Years later, when historians and royal biographers looked back at Catherine's response to the Manchester tragedy, they would identify it as a turning point not just in her own development as a public figure, but in the evolution of the monarchy's relationship with the British people. By choosing authenticity over protocol, presence over performance, and humanity over hierarchy, she had demonstrated a different way of using privilege and platform to serve others. But for the families in Manchester who had been touched by her quiet visits, the impact was much more personal and immediate. They had learned that they were not alone in their grief, that their children's lives had mattered to people they had never met, and that sometimes the most powerful response to tragedy is simply showing up with an open heart and a willingness to share in both sorrow and hope. The story of those visits became part of Manchester's collective memory, passed down through families and shared at community gatherings. Children who had been too young to understand the tragedy would grow up hearing about the princess who came, not with fanfare or cameras, but with tissues and time, ready to listen to stories about the people they had loved and lost. In a world that often seemed divided by differences and distracted by superficial concerns, Catherine's response to the Manchester tragedy offered a different model. One based on the simple but profound recognition that in our deepest joys and sorrows, we are all fundamentally the same. We all love deeply, grieve intensely, and find healing through genuine human connection. Sometimes, the most revolutionary act is simply being present with others in their pain, honoring their stories, and reminding them that they are seen, heard, and loved.